So, Peter Tatchell.
Thank you all very, very much. It's a great pleasure to join you here today, and I want to express my thanks and appreciation to the Heart of England NHS Foundation Trust for organising this event, which is not exactly the kind of event that every foundation trust has organised. So I think you are, in many respects, leading the way. So well done. My starting point is that health is an equality issue. Or to put it another way, inequality leads to a whole range of disadvantages when it comes to people's health. We know that people who suffer disadvantage and discrimination are bound to have less successful health outcomes. So equality ought to be a very central part of every NHS Foundation's work, because by making equality a key goal, you will be helping to remedy the inequalities that lead to poorer health outcomes. As we know, equality includes not just equal access to health services, but should, even more importantly, result in equal outcomes. So it's great to have the commitment, but we also have to have the results. The real indicator of equality is what actually happens in people's lives. It's great to have fine statements and policies. It's wonderful to have, outlines and programs and targets that all point in the right direction. But at the end of the day, the true measure is what is the actual end result. When there are disparities and divergences in health and ill health among different communities, we certainly have a problem. It means we are failing as a society, and it means the NHS is failing too. Perhaps not by intention, but certainly in terms of the inequality of people's lives and health. We can measure the NHS's success in terms of targets met, and targets are important, and in the overall state of health of the nation. That's great, that's fine. But if those improvements in health are not equal across all sectors of the population, then the NHS is failing. If some communities are having greater incidences of ill health than others, or better health outcomes than others, we are failing those people who are not up there at the level of others. Now, the causes of health and ill health are multifactorial. There's no single one cause. I'm not saying that equality itself is the only cause. It's a significant cause. I think we need to look at a whole range of issues that may contribute to ill health and health inequality. Income, housing, education, social status, environmental factors, family and cultural traditions, and of course, healthcare provision. But also, we need to think about prejudice and discrimination. What are the consequences of prejudice and discrimination? I would say that these two also adversely impact on people's health. The effects of stigma and exclusion and a lack of equal opportunities negatively impacts on many different communities. It impacts differently for people who are black and ethnic minority, travellers, disabled, ex-offenders, women, immigrants and refugees, and working class people. But for this session, I'd like to specifically focus on the health inequalities experienced by those who are LGB or T. I think there is a wealth of evidence that, measured in terms of health outcomes, society as a whole, and the NHS in particular, is failing LGBT communities. Not by deliberation or intent, not by design, but just by not looking sufficiently at what is needed to ensure health parity for people who have a different sexual orientation or gender identity from the mainstream. And this is not to deny or in any way diminish the positive things that many people in the NHS are doing. I'm sure many of you are doing great things for LGBT communities. But looking at the health service as a whole across all parts of the country, we see huge divergences. Some are very good, some are average, and some are still quite poor. Now, my contention is that homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia are actively harming LGBT health. We've heard that the criminalisation of gay and bisexual men only ended in England in 2003. Only in 2003. Up until then, many aspects, most aspects of gay male and bisexual male life remained criminalised under laws, many of them dating back centuries. They were only finally repealed in 2003 in England, later in Scotland, and later in Northern Ireland. The last major anti-gay law was only repealed in 2013, the ban on same-sex marriage. And indeed, if you reflect back when the first major law reforms began in 1999, with the end to the ban on LGBT people serving in the armed forces, and then soon afterwards the equalisation of the age of consent, if you think about it, until 1999, Britain had by volume the largest number of anti-gay laws of any country in the world. Unbelievable. A supposed democracy had so many anti-LGBT laws. And since 1999, until 2013 with same-sex marriage, all those major laws have been gone. They've all been repealed. It's the most successful and fastest law reform campaign in British history. And many of those laws, unlike criminalisation, did not exclusively or solely affect gay and bisexual men. So we had the Gender Recognition Act to give trans people rights in 2004. We had an end to the ban on same-sex couples, both lesbian same-sex couples and gay same-sex couples, the ban on them fostering and adopting children. I think it was 2003. We had the repeal of Section 28, which equally criminalised any teaching about lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender issues. We also had the legislation to protect LGBT people against discrimination in the workplace, and then later in the provision of goods and services. So this vast range of homophobic, biphobic, and transphobic laws was repealed in a very short space of time, in the space of 14 years. I can't even think of any other country in the world where a set of laws affecting a particular community on such a scale has been repealed so quickly. So it's a huge tribute, not just to the LGBT community itself, which of course led that campaign, but our straight friends and allies, perhaps many of you. So has been a collective effort that we have progressed so far. But, of course, changing the law is one thing. Changing the culture, changing the values, changing the institutions is something quite different. There is massive of evidence which shows a link between prejudice, discrimination, and hate crime affecting LGBT people and health outcomes. We know that in our schools today, about or just under half of all LGBT pupils have suffered bullying. And for trans kids, it's particularly bad. We know that when it comes to hate crime, roughly about a third of the LGBT population have experienced hate crime at some point in their lives, sometimes over the course of their life, not once or twice, but 3, 4, or 5 times. So this has a really negative, damaging, and often cumulative long-term psychological effect. I think that it's undoubtedly true that the psychological and emotional pressure and stress caused by anti-LGBT intolerance and marginalization often leads to damaged physical and mental health. I'd say that prejudice and discrimination contribute to things like low self-esteem, fear, anxiety, depression, drug and alcohol abuse, eating disorders, HIV infection, self-harm, including suicide and attempted suicide. It can also sometimes produce family estrangement, relationship breakups, job loss, financial ruin, and homelessness. So that long-term knock-on consequences for some LGBT people is very, very severe. Anti-LGBT attitudes and behavior can, of course, trigger an ongoing cycle of despair and depression, a self-destructive cycle, which includes and results in mental and physical ill health. So in many ways, I would say that although things have got better in the wider society and in the health service, we do have something of an LGBT health crisis. A crisis, a series of negative indices that are far greater than those suffered by the general population. So let's just look at a few of the basic statistics. There have been lots of different surveys, and they have come out with some variable results, but in broad terms, let's say alcohol use, for example. In broad terms, about 9 out of 10 lesbian and bisexual women drink, and of those, over a third drink 3 or more times a week, compared to a quarter of women in general. About 2 in 5 gay and bisexual men drink alcohol 3 or more days a week, compared to only about, considerably less percentage, about 10% less, compared to men in with men in general. And when it comes to drug use, recreational drug use, lesbian and bisexual women are 5 times more likely to have taken drugs than heterosexual women, who their figure is only about 3%. That's a very clear disparity. When it comes to gay and bisexual men, roughly about half have taken recreational drugs in the last year, compared to just 1 in 8 of men in general. When it comes to smoking, LGBT people are much more likely to smoke. 25% of lesbians smoke, compared to 15% of heterosexual women. 33% of gay men smoke, compared to 21% of heterosexual men. Different parts of the LGBT community have different degrees of mental health issues. It isn't universal, and as we've heard, for trans people, the indices are much more severe than for LGBT people. But generally, again, there's a whole range of different studies, but when it comes to depression, the LGBT indice is somewhere between 28 to 40%, depending on which segment of the community you're surveying, compared to only 6% of the general population. When it comes to self-harm, LGBT people experience, or 20 to 25% of LGBT people have suffered some form of self-harm or inflicted some form of self-harm, compared to only just over 2% of the general population. And when it comes to suicide attempts, 20 to 40% of LGBT people have attempted suicide, compared to only just over 4% of the general population. All these things really do indicate that there are health differentials which affect people based on sexual orientation and gender identity. As I said at the outset, there are many complex, diverse, multifactorial reasons for that, but prejudice and discrimination, or the fear of, are undoubtedly significant factors. When we look at some of the statistics in terms of inequalities, we know that different sections of the community, the LGBT community, suffer different degrees of inequality. And I'd just like to briefly focus on one segment, which is often overlooked, and that's older LGBT people. We know from the statistics that 80% of older LGBT people age as single people, compared to only 40% of the general population. We know that of older LGBT people, 75% live alone, compared to only 33% of the general population. And of older LGBT people, 90% have no children who may be available to care for them, compared to only 20% of the general population not having any children. So that means that there is, not by intention or design, but there is a bias, a disadvantage, and inequality there that can impact on the quality of older people's lives. So just finally, I'd like to just take a talk through what can be done to help make the NHS more LGBT friendly. I certainly don't have all the answers, and I suspect many of you have quite a few of them. But I just want to go through just some ideas that you might want to think about and flag up. The obvious one is for all parts of the NHS to have an equal opportunities policy, but not just to have the policy, but to monitor it and enforce it, to do an audit to see whether that policy is actually producing the desired results. It's also really obvious that the NHS should be, where appropriate and relevant, referring LGBT people to relevant LGBT organisations. So there are specific LGBT organisations that a victim of hate crime might appropriately be referred to. So if someone comes into accident and emergency having been bashed because of their sexuality or gender identity, not only would it be good that the NHS treats their physical injuries, but perhaps also refers them on to an LGBT support group. And if perhaps people in the NHS who are LGBT have mental health issues, refer them to an appropriate LGBT mental health charity. Another idea, which I'm sure you probably do, is making visible the NHS's commitment to LGBT inclusion and equality by having posters around the hospital indicating that. And also by putting LGBT information on display, information about LGBT and T relevant organizations that people can contact and get support from. Information about campaign groups, because maybe if they've been a victim of hate crime, they might want to pursue this by trying to get redress and to raise the public profile of the kind of hate crime they suffered. There may be a case, I don't know what the practice is here, but there may be a case for seeking to get staff to sign an equality statement as part of their job contract, which would include not just LGBT issues, but also race and women's equality and other equalities as well. I think there's also a really important need for NHS staff education. And again, I don't know what the practice is in this particular trust, but I do think it's really important that the NHS doesn't take for granted that all the staff know or understand the issues. It's not that the staff are intentionally homophobic, biphobic or transphobic, but just they're not perhaps aware particularly of trans issues or gender diverse or non-binary issues that concern lots of LGBT people. And I think this is particularly important because a significant proportion of NHS staff come from outside of the UK, from countries and cultures where there isn't the same acknowledgement and understanding of LGBT issues. And this is not to blame or scapegoat those people, but they need the education and support and the information so that they can make the supportive decisions and give NHS LGBT patients the kind of support they need. Another option is, of course, for the NHS Foundation Trust to use its website and social media to promote positive, inclusive LGBT messages, to send a signal that LGBT people are accepted and welcomed and will get respect, dignity and support. The final thing I'll perhaps finish on this about is these, of course, are all relatively short-term things that can be done. But in the long term, I think we need to think about how do we create a future culture that will be different from the culture we currently have, so that LGBT people don't experience the kind of marginalization, ostracism, prejudice and discrimination and hate crime that too many of them do today. And of course, there are two basic things. First of all, we need to ensure that the media acts responsibly and fairly, that it reports accurately, that it doesn't demonize and scapegoat. As you're all aware, there's been a whole vast, horrendous scapegoating of trans people, particularly in the last year or so, by large sections of the media. And I think we need to challenge that. We need to call it out. The National Union of Journalists has a very good code of conduct. And if every journalist followed it, there wouldn't be a problem. The problem is they don't. And that's why I'm a passionate, albeit somewhat reluctant, but passionate defender and exponent of the full implementation of the Leveson Report. The Leveson Report has not been fully implemented. The issues around right of reply and redress for victims of media bias and misreporting is very weak. The body that's been set up is funded by the newspaper industry. It hasn't got much teeth. It has a very poor record of redress for LGBT, in particular trans victims. So we do need the full implementation of the Leveson Report to make sure there is a totally independent, impartial watchdog which will have legal sanctions against those who violate its principles. And one of the principles of Leveson is about non-biased, non-scapegoating, non-stereotyped, non-prejudiced reporting. And that's really important, not just for LGBT people, but also for black and ethnic minority communities, for women, for immigrants and refugees and many others who are often victims of bad prejudice reporting. The other long-term goal is, of course, education. Education in our schools. I find it astonishing that equality and diversity lessons are not mandatory in our schools. We know that no child comes out of the womb bigoted. That's learned behavior. They learn it from their parents or other adults or their peers at school. And we know where these kinds of lessons have been trialed, it does dramatically reduce prejudice and bullying, and subsequently, those people go on to be adults who don't share and promote prejudice. So to me, the idea that there should be mandatory equality and diversity lessons in every school, from the first year of primary education, continuing regularly throughout a pupil's life, through their secondary years, it just seems so obvious. Because it is a way, a practical way, in which we can reduce the level of prejudice. We can reduce the level of bullying in the school playground, and we can reduce hate crime on our streets. So, like many others, I've been constantly challenging and seeking the government's agreement that it will do this. But so far we haven't got the commitment. Again, there are some schools who do it voluntarily through PSHE. But it's some schools. And again, the level is very patchy. I was at a school yesterday and they were saying that they had 2 lessons in a year on what we might broadly call equality and diversity lessons. 2 in a year, that's not good enough. You know, we need to make sure that it's every fortnight or every month, and it starts from the first year of primary school and continues throughout a pupil's life. I think that is the way in which we move forward to ensure that in the future we have a culture where the prejudice and discrimination that so often results in poor health outcomes is perhaps not entirely eliminated, though that would be great, but at least very dramatically reduced. So just to wind up, I'd say that overall, British society, including the health service, has moved mountains in the last 2 decades. And thanks to all of you who've been a part of that. But there is still obviously work to do. The Gender Recognition Act was great when it was first introduced. It was progress. But now, compared to Argentina, Ireland, Malta, and many other countries, it really is behind the curve. It needs reform, and the government is committed to reform, although exactly when, we still aren't quite sure. You know, trans people need the dignity, the respect, the self-affirmation, and the right to determine their own identity without having it dictated by the medical profession or the state. It's easy, it's obvious, it works in Ireland, it works in Malta, why not here? We know that when it comes to the plight of LGBT refugees fleeing persecution in other countries, still, although it's better than the past, still those refugees have a higher rejection rate by the Home Office than political, religious, or ethnic refugees. They may have a really strong, compelling case, but on average, they will have a higher rate of refusal, certainly on their first application, than most other refugees. And that really is so very, very wrong. Many of them, or some of them, are put in asylum detention centres, which are prisons by another name. You know, these are people who have fled attempts to kill them, perhaps imprisonment, all kinds of terrible things have happened to them, and we put them in a glorified prison. That is so, so wrong, and it compounds their psychological and emotional distress. Most of these refugees arrive here, some with physical health problems, perhaps as a result of torture or hate crime attacks, but many of them with severe mental health issues because of the psychological abuse they've suffered from their families, their communities, their religious leaders, their politicians, the police, the prison system in their home country. And we compound that psychological and emotional damage by putting them in detention. How can anyone prepare a proper asylum application when they're in detention? It cannot be done, or cannot be done effectively and fully. So that's another issue we need to address. And when it comes to hate crime, although there's been much better reporting, still it is underreported. Still, LGBT hate crime is underreported. All the indications indicate or suggest that. So we need to find ways in which the police service and community organisations can take steps to encourage and support reporting of hate crime. And that is where frontline NHS staff have an important role to play. As I mentioned, if someone comes into casualty having been a victim of hate crime, and if they express or you deduce that it was of a homophobic or biphobic or transphobic nature, it's really important that you encourage them to report it and that you give them the information about where to go. How do they report it? Where do they go? What do they need to do? So I think I'll finish there and say that I'm really pleased to be at this conference today. I'm really pleased that you're here, and that with people like you committed to change, to inclusion, to challenging the homophobia, biphobia and transphobia that has so often affected the health service, among other organisations, we will get there in the end. Thank you.
Peter Tatchell, ladies and gentlemen.